And now, it's time for another episode of 20 Questions with your host, Peter Hazelwood.
Hello, and thank you for joining me. Today I'm joined by the wonderful Richard Denning, who you might know for his game designs such as The Great Fire of London 66 and Nine Worlds, for instance, or you might know him as one of the directors of the UK Games Expo. You might not know that Richard is a qualified GP, has worked as a GP, and also writes historical and fantasy novels. Hi Richard, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. Well, glad to be with you.
Yes, I mean, you are a particularly interesting person to talk to. I mean, in general, you have a lot going on, a lot of different skills, but it's also quite a pertinent time to speak to you about all things UK Games Expo in a year plus now of working within the confines of a pandemic.
Yes, certainly a very different year to what we've all been used to.
Yes, indeed. Okay, well, I'm going to start off. I've got a total of 20 questions, thereabouts, and I'm going to try and keep track of how many I'm asking because I might have to tailor my new questions as a follow-up, but we'll start with a nice, easy one. So we've got, what's your first memory of playing board games?
First playing board games. I mean, games. Generally speaking, I suppose when I was a child playing, everybody played things like, I think the first game I could really remember is a thing called Buccaneer, which is an old pirate-y sort of game where you go around and try and collect gold and various things like that and go and bury them on an island. And that must have been something we played. I must have been like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or something like that when I played that for the first time. Yeah. But games proper, I think I always say the thing that really triggered it off for me was I saw a movie called Callan in which is a 70s spy detective type series. I don't think it's shown. I haven't seen reruns of it for many years, but there was a Battle of Gettysburg being played in it with miniatures and things, and that was the thing. I think I was about 11 at the time that triggered me off to sort of investigating games. So that was getting more into miniature games, war games initially, but then after that you tend to get into board games, role-playing games, and the whole thing really.
Yeah, well, that's interesting then. I mean, I know we do get people coming into the hobby from Warhammer and tabletop miniatures, but that feels like a bigger deal, a bigger barrier to entry in a way than a sort of a gateway board game. So what do you remember being the first proper sort of modern board game you got into?
Right, so I was playing, as I say, we did a lot of through teen years, so I was at school and things. So the things that we predominantly played were mainly figure gaming, war games, but we discovered things like Axis and Allies, obviously Diplomacy, a game to lose all your friends at, and Risk and things. So we do a lot of weekends where we would be playing long games of Diplomacy or Axis and Allies and those sorts of things. So they were those sorts of war inspired or linked in some fashion type of games. But the first kind of Euro type of games that we discovered was Catan. And I think around the time it sort of came out in the 90s, 25th anniversary just recently, of course. So I think I came across it pretty well immediately that it was in circulation at a point that I was just starting to explore games beyond those sorts of board war game sort of things. So I'd come across Bonanza, what the family still calls the Bean game, and that was very much a tried and tested game that we took on family holidays. So we did a lot of games in the 90s where we'd be playing Bonanza a lot in the evening in hotels and things, and people would come over curiously and have a look at this thing, and it was obviously something a bit unusual in those days. But I think it's Catan very much was the thing we played a lot in the mid 90s.
Very cool, very cool. I also understand that you are rather into your RPGs as well.
Yes, I mean, that was something, again, I discovered back around the same time as we started with the miniature gaming, way back in about 1979, 1980. There was a game shop opened in Warwick where I grew up, and I went in there and they two boxed games on the shelves. One was the red box of basic Dungeons and Dragons, which they've republished it nowadays with Stranger Things as the theme and that sort of thing. But that was basic Dungeons and Dragons, and the Black Box of Traveller, which was the first I think probably the first science fiction role playing game. And they were both. I came across them around that time, around about 1980. So through school years, we played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. Not so much the Traveller, but more the Dungeons and Dragons and things. And I went on into university times.
I see. Okay, very good. Okay, well, moving on to sort of game design, I'd have to ask you, which is more important to you? What's your starting basis? Is it theme or mechanics?
I think very much the first thing, the theme is the thing that interests me with a game. I like the sort of to know what it's about. Now, the mechanics ultimately is what makes you think this is a good game, because you sit down and you play things and you think that's interesting, that's clever. I haven't come across that before, or I like the way that particular take or twist on a particular mechanic that maybe has been done before. But the thing that would probably interest me first of all is not somebody saying, "Oh yeah, you turn the cards over and you choose two of them," and that's not what would interest me. It would be, "Oh, you're going to be the Duke of Burgundy or something," or you're going to be, I don't know, trying to spread your Viking colonies across England or something. It would be the theme of the idea first of all that would interest me, and then it's the feel for whether or not that theme comes through into the mechanic, which is the key thing, really, to feel that, yes, this is now feels like I'm a Viking doing the Viking stuff. That's important, I think.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I know you a bit, and I'm aware, obviously, you are a qualified GP, so you are a scientist. And that tends to go hand in hand, in my mind, with a sort of a mathematical brain. So I find it interesting. So James Emerson, so the person I'm designing a lot with, he is very much approaching from a mechanical point of view first. But in a way, you almost seem more like the creative, because you've got the author in you, and you've got those creative juices. So you're coming up with the Great Fire of London as a great theme, or Vikings and stuff like that. So I find it very interesting that you obviously approach game design very differently to James.
Yeah, I think I usually start with. Commonly, it will come from a theme and idea, and so whether that be a rhyme, as in the case of Tinker Tailor, a nursery rhyme, or an event like the Great Fire of London or something like that. So the idea of okay, and then there must be a game in that somewhere, and then where do you go and get your mechanics from to make the game happen? I mean, occasionally the idea of a mechanics or something will occur to me, and you have to think, okay, where do you get a game from that? But very much I would say that the other way around, more commonly than not. I come up with an idea that I want to do a game about this. Okay, what mechanics would fit that? Would feel right for that. And that's very much the way round, I suppose. So I think, yes, you're right. Although medicine is a scientific subject, and there is a scientific approach to that, there is. I've always enjoyed the creative bit of it, coming from having ideas for something like books or games, and then exploring what you're going to do with the idea.
Well, that brings me on to my next question, which was actually, how did you start designing games?
Well, the very first, I way back to sort of school days, I would tinker around with things, and you would. You take house rule things, or you try and do a board game or something. So I remember lots of games we did. We did a whole summer holiday, World War II, massive battle game that went on the whole summer holidays. We do a map of Europe, which was literally something like 12 foot by 12 foot. It was all over a table, and you had to crawl on the table to get to bits of it. And that was a huge game and so we were doing those sort of things of coming up with ideas and thinking, how do we make a thing? But the first time I really sort of designed a game was with Great Fire, and that came out of, I'd been reading about the Great Fire of London as a bit of research, again for a book, and then it occurred to me that I've never seen anyone do a game based around it, and and I'd been reading a lot about the wind and how the wind was the key thing, because it was going in certain directions, and that's what affected the flow of the fire. And so naturally that's where the mechanic came out of the wind cards that drive the fire on, and it happens in Great Fire. But I think that's the first game, and that was, I'd started work on that. I think it was, it was the second time I'd been to Essen. So I went to Essen for the first time in 2007, when we were starting to think about 2006, just before the first Expo, which is 2007. And then we obviously returned in 2008. And the very first idea of a game came to me a week before Essen in 2008, and I very quickly got hold of a map of London from the fire. There was one that was done about a year after the fire, to sort of chart the destruction and the damage, because there was all sorts of property disputes as to who owned which bits, and that was a great source for making the map. Made a map very quickly just by drawing on card, and got some components together, Blue Peter style, and got it ready for the trip out, the ferry to France. And the curious thing about that was, I remember getting this game out for the first time, and what we eventually called Ferrycon, which was the trip to Essen, and people would have a go at that, and we started to play it, and then a Welsh male voice choir suddenly started singing Men of Harlech over at the bar. And my father had been playing with his abandoners, because he was Welsh and he went off to join the boyos, as it were. And it's very, very peculiar, sort of doing this play test for the first time of Great Fire with that choir singing Men of Harlech in the background. Quite atmospheric, actually. Anyway, that was the first idea for a game.
Very good. Obviously, we'll come back to the Expo, but I would ask you if you have any tips for someone aspiring to be a game designer.
I think, the first thing is that you have to accept the fact that a lot of people aren't going to like your games. Games are naturally a thing of taste, and there are some games out there, and games which I've even given awards out for, in the case of the Expo, when personally you think, well, I don't necessarily like that one. Of course, I'm not going to name any names, but there's one or two that you think, okay, I wouldn't have given it an award if it was been me, but that's just me. I've got my own taste. Everyone's got their own taste, and I know there are people that hate my games and there are people that love my games, and that's just life. And you've just got to accept the fact that you will get in the same sort of reviews on board, whatever it is on Board Game Geek, you can get those people that say hated this game with a vengeance, and then you'll get other people saying love this idea. And so I think you just have to get a bit of a hard skin and a bit of thick skin to things, first of all, and then out of that also is the business of playtesting, because you have to do an awful lot of playtesting, and the only way that you find when things don't work is by exposing the game to the wild, as it were, of people. And I remember when we had some rule in Great Fire to do with intensifying the fire, when you had extra fire cones on at certain intervals in the game, and to me, it was very clear that you just took 3 cones and you put these 3 cones somewhere on the board where there is fire. And at some point, I saw a playtest happening where there was just vast amounts of fire everywhere. We've run out of cones. It's not possible. So yes, it is. Every time we put one of these things on, we take 3 cones and we put them in every space where there is fire. and you think, but that's not what the rule says. Then you reread the rule that you've got. And you think, okay, I suppose it could be interpreted that way. So you have to. That getting people to try things and how they interpret the rules will not be what you understand the rules to be sometimes, quite often. And then you have to go back and rewrite that particular sentence and find a clearer way of doing it. So lots of playtesting would be the key, I would say.
That's yes. Rule writing does seem to be an art almost in itself. So I pretty much wrote the rules to Tranquility, and I know that they were a bit brief because we were working to a very small physical limit on the size of the rule book. But then people are reading things into your rules or interpreting them in different ways. So yeah, that's a really good tip.
And the problem with that, of course, is if you do go down the whole hog of them writing incredibly detailed things, your rule book ends up being like War and Peace or something.
Too much. Yeah,
too much. So it's a difficult balance.
Absolutely. Well, just last question on sort of your design at the moment then, and I'd ask, what projects have you got in the pipeline at the moment?
Okay, so we are just hopefully this year or maybe next year. It all depends on all the things that are happening. Are working on a expansion to Nine Worlds. We already did one expansion, which was Sagas and Treasures. This is going to be a slightly bigger expansion called Creatures and Monsters. So it brings in various monsters and things that are in the Norse mythology. So things like Grendel and dragons and trolls and all sorts of things. So the idea there is that apart from the area control game that is Nine Worlds, you now also have to contend with the fact that there are these monsters appearing, and have to consider whether you send some of your resources, some of your warriors off to deal with the monsters. And if you do, then if you beat the monsters, there are certain rewards. But if you don't beat them, then there are consequences and things, and equally you'll be diverting some of your actions to that, and that might mean other people who decide to leave the monsters alone get a certain advantage in the Nine Worlds and things. So it's a sort of balance to be had in that regard. So that's been in production at the moment. We'd originally planned to have that ready for Essen this year, but the $64,000 question is it going to be an Essen or not? And if it does happen, will we be there and all this sort of thing? So it might be something that we do for next year. That's our current next game. And then we are doing quite a lot of play testing on an actual Euro game. So not one of the things we haven't done in the past with Medusa earlier. So what you might call a true Euro game, resources and stuff like that. We've got our area control games and Great Fire, which is more of a sort of simulation type of game, really. And Magnificent Flying Machines is very much American style, race sort of game. So we've got a game we're working on called Oranges and Lemons, which is again inspired by nursery rhyme and things, but obviously set in London medieval times, where you're using the various things mentioned in the rhymes to make resources, and then using them to build things and ultimately make bells, which are put into churches, and they give you some advantages in the game. So that's something we're play testing at the moment. And in the long grasp, we've got a sort of another version of Great Fire underway, which is Great Fire of Chicago, which is another fire which happened 200 years after the Great Fire in London was the one in Chicago, and different sort of circumstances, which make it interesting to use the same mechanics, but then start to think, okay, how do we take that to a new map, a new situation? So I don't know if you do the Great Fire of Chicago happened. They were given an award for the best firefighting system in the world the year before the city burnt down, because it was all to do with alarms and things like that. And that we brought into the game, the alarm system going wrong in certain ways and how that could influence the way the fire spread. So yeah, got a few bits and pieces in development.
Fantastic. Good news for the fans of the Richard Denning. Not so much for the people who go on BGG and give you 1 out of 10, but
No. But all 4 of my fans will.
Now let's not belittle ourselves here. Yes. False modesty. Okay. Well, let's move on to the expo. It's hard to know what you're better known for, but I would have to ask you sort of. Why did you start the UK Games Expo?
Well, we've been doing all the way through the years from after university and onwards. I was going to lots of wargame shows in the UK, because again I was doing a lot of miniature wargaming, but also at that point starting to discover board games, and we were still doing a lot of role playing games. And eventually I reached a point of thinking, well, there's lots of miniature wargame shows around the country that can get potentially quite a few thousand people, in the case of something like Salute or something in London. But there wasn't really much in the way of a large-scale board game conventions at that stage. And the largest sort of show, I suppose, when you take the war games element away, would be something like Gen Con UK that ran for a number of years. But at that point, I was aware, I had been to Gen Con UK, but I was aware that it was a very sort of focused event, primarily role-playing, and very much sort of organised play-orientated, and not something that had a lot of board gaming going on, and not a show where there was designers taking their games to shows and showing their designs and their new releases and all of that kind of thing. And then I think I'd heard, and I came across Essen. I've obviously been running for years at that point, but you discover these things when you start to dig around a bit. And I'd also heard of Gen Con UK, US, of course, Indianapolis. So what we decided to do was to have a go to Essen. But that particular year, before we got to that stage, our games club that I was chairman of at the time, its numbers were dwindling, and we decided we'd do a little open day for a day, just to try and get some people along. And I thought maybe we'd get 100 or 200 people. We managed to get about 400 people to this little local war games show in a gymnasium in Birmingham, long since forgotten. But on that particular day, a couple of people were there who wanted to run some tournaments. And so we started talking to them, and then we ended up doing the first of the sort of European Dungeons and Dragons miniatures tournaments or something. And off the back of that, a few of the tournaments happened, and we had a bit of role playing, and we had a few retailers, and that was a thing that was called Game that happened the year before Expo. But the issue with Game was that it was very organised play orientated, and there's no problem with that at all. You need that stuff to be going on, but I really wanted that sort of public element to the show where people were coming in and they were looking at the exhibitors and looking at the publishers' stuff, and they were, all of that type of things. I was looking at Gen Con and thinking about that, looking at Essen and thinking about that. So, and the chap that ran the game, which is a friend I went to university with, decided to take it to Manchester and run it up there. And we said, okay, well, we'll launch something ourselves in Birmingham. And that was the year then we went to Essen and we went round and spoke to exhibitors, UK exhibitors, one or two which are still around. People like Surprise Stare. I remember a conversation with them, and then basically saying, "Well, yeah, absolutely. If there was something in the UK that was even approaching this sort of concept of what goes on with Essen and things, then yes, we would come." And so that was the eventual trigger point to have a go and book the first expo in 2007.
It's been an interesting journey for the show. You'd have to say, from the sounds of it, it had gone pretty swimmingly up until pretty much this last year.
Yes, I mean, obviously the early days was, I suppose you might call a hobby event primarily, but we always wanted to make it mainstream and have families and things like that. But it took a while to build that up, of course. But we reached the point, it was 6 years at the Clarendon Suites, which was the original venue. Sort of a Sonic Lodge in Birmingham, and that was going very well. And towards the end of that time, the CEO of Mayfair Games, as was and as Deviant, that became Asmodee UK, both of those came to see us and basically said they would support the show. They think it could go bigger, but we'd have to upgrade in terms of size and things. So that meant the move to the Hilton Hotel, which is obviously a bit of a gamble at the time, but that went well, and it continued to expand. And after 2 years at the Hilton, it became obvious that we were already outgrowing it. So we booked a third year there. We put a marquee in the car park, and then started to look at the NEC for 2016, which was the year that we went to there. And then since then, it obviously took off substantially. So 16, 17, 18, 19 has seen a lot of 20-30% growth and things. And 2020, it could have been even bigger. But obviously, the world changed, as it did for many people in 2020. But it was all going. Yeah, it was. I think all the way through to that point, we haven't really had any significant challenges. A few issues here and there and problems, but nothing insurmountable. And I think the growth, we were lucky because I think we were growing at the same time that the mainstream interest in gaming expanded, through things like Big Bang Theory and Stranger Things maybe, and other influences. And suddenly people are going into games cafes all over the country, and we sort of to some extent rode that wave. But obviously, eventually, the good times ended, and now we've got to see what we can do going forward again.
Yeah.
Future.
Obviously, I do have to ask then, how specifically has COVID-19 affected the UK Games Expo?
Well, hugely. So the difference is when we started the expo off, we were just a hobby event, and for many years we were just a hobby event, doing it in our spare time. But in about 2015, we realised we got to the stage the amount of workload was becoming so enormous that we really had to start doing it as a job. So Tony, the director, we started to pay him. He did a lot of coding work. I carried on doing general practice, but I started to reduce the sessions a bit in those days. But it was only really when we got to the NEC that we'd started to be able to afford to pay ourselves something. And it then got to the stage of me realising that I was going to have to leave the day job, as it were, because it was becoming so busy that I was getting phone calls during morning surgery. And they think that the pivotal moment was when a lady just walked in the door and literally fainted and collapsed on the floor.
Oh, wow.
And I sort of phoned for the nurse, we ran over and we started doing stuff. And then my phone went off and it was Tony. And he said, I need to talk. I said, I can't talk right now. I've got, patient. And he said, well, is she alive? I said, well, she is at the moment, but we're trying to maintain that. And it then became obvious that the amount of time it was starting to take while I was having to take phone calls between patients, and and then you start thinking, okay, now we may reach a stage where this now becomes dangerous, the distractions and things. So and unfortunately, it was at that stage that it was starting to pay, not as much as it was going when I was a GP, but decent enough so we could afford to pay ourselves and take on ultimately an administrator and a logistics chap and ultimately a marketing lady. And that had got to that stage that there was enough there to pay. And sometimes people say, "Oh, how can it take all that time to plan a show?" I remember I was walking behind someone at the expo one year, and they sort of said, "Oh, well, how long do you think this is quite big? This, isn't it? How long do you think it takes them to plan?" And the chap just turned around and said, "Well, I think probably a couple of weeks." I was thinking, okay,
wow.
We do get a bit of quiet time in the summer months, but basically, it pretty much from once we hit Essen onwards, all the way through to the show, it's then, getting increasingly busy. And the 3 or 4 months immediately before the show are more than a full-time job, really. But yes, it's affected us because, sorry, to answer your question, because obviously no income to the show in 2020, apart from a bit of marketing income, and we did a virtual event which brought in a little bit of money, but only just about covered the cost of doing it. So, it was, I think, good to do, but it was only really it wasn't something that earned as much in the way of income. So we had to go out and ask the exhibitors to and all of them kindly sort of rolled over funds and things. That's helped. We've taken one of these government loans. We've had grants. We've had furloughs and things for staff at times, and that's meant that we've reached the point that we can survive 2022 even if we can't run a show in 2021. We'd like to run a show in 2021 because that would make life a lot easier for us, but there's no absolute guarantee of that. So we needed to reach the point and put things in place that meant that if we got no income again this year, or only marginal amounts that we're getting from a little bit of marketing work that we do, then we can survive to 2022. And now we know, we can see that. We can see, okay, we've got enough money. We run out of money at this point, at which time we should be starting to have income in from the following year's show and things. So we can see a light at the end of that particular tunnel, even though it's a very long tunnel.
Yes, I suppose that is good, even though, as you say, even now, no guarantees that you could have a show this year. Speaking of which, so you made a decision a little while ago to move it back to the last weekend of July to August?
Yes, 30th, 1st of August, so 30th of July to 1st of August for the 3 days.
Very sensible, it seems to me. How do you feel about the prospect of that going ahead?
Well, so in the one sense, it is after the date line in the roadmap that theoretically events are supposed to be allowed. 21st of June is this magical day. However, a lot of people have emailed us and said, "Oh, you're fine, aren't you? Because you're 5 weeks after the date, so you're definitely happening." And so, well, it's not quite as simple as that. First of all, that they're saying that's the earliest time that things will happen, and everything has to follow through, doesn't it? We have to hit the deadlines prior to that If any of them get delayed, then the ultimate date will get delayed. On top of that, there is this committee, I think it's called the Events Research Programme or something, whose job is to report to government about events and what rules and regulations and restrictions will apply. Until they've done that, which could be as late as May or even nudging June to before they finalise that, we're not going to know under what circumstances a show could happen. So it could be that the vaccinations are doing very, very well at the moment. The rates continue to drop and all of that, and they reach a point where they say, okay, shows are okay and relatively limited restrictions, or they could be quite significant restrictions where we might find we have an event is allowed, but maybe with only 4,000 or 5,000 people in the venue rather than up to 15,000 that we get on a Saturday, an expo. Or they may just say no big events this year or until the autumn or whatever. And of course, until we know all that, it's a guessing game at present. But all you can do sort of think, okay, let's proceed on that basis and on the basis that it's possible until we clearly know it's not. And there's a deadline point from our point of view. We would need to around that 21st of June is a point that we would have to pull a plug for definite if it wasn't going to happen, because all our contracts and various things have like 28 day, 30 odd day cancellation things where we can avoid having to pay money. So we'd have to decide by then. Of course, an awful lot of people would need a decision to be clear before then, probably themselves. I think there's a chance. And things at times you hear the news and it looks good. At other times you hear the news and it doesn't sound so good. But it's not by any means guaranteed. And I think we just have to proceed, hoping we can, see what the rules are, see where we go from there. And if we can't do, the one thing I think we've pretty well decided is that we're not going to postpone again into September or October. If we can't do it in July, I think we would just say that's it for 21. Let's plan for 22, because I think this indefinitely. We were working out we'd postponed the event, cancelled the event, reinvented the event effectively with virtual, and then postponed again. So I think this would be either another cancellation or postponement or whatever. And I think you reach a point where you've got to say, okay, if it's not happening then, it's not happening this year, and let's look to 22 and see where we go from there.
Fair enough. I can't imagine. You made me laugh when you overheard that conversation about how long do you think it takes to plan this event.
Yes.
Running my own very small event, which was maybe up to 100 people, even that took longer than 2 weeks. But I can't imagine the extra difficulties that come with just not knowing what's going to happen and the variables and the different kinds of events that you might look to hold, or do we move it, etc.
Yes, no, it has been. It's been a continue. I think we've reached that stage of real. I'm just now getting a certain level of exhaustion about the whole thing. Yeah. So basically, it's July or bust, as it were, for 21. But knowing now that we can reach 22, we're sort of a little bit more relaxed about it, because we think, okay, if we can do it, we can do it. If we can't, it's not the ends of the earth. We can come back next year. And we'll go from there. And the one thing we have decided is that we made a decision recently about, until recently, as you know yourself, we've had a couple of floor plans that we've been messing about with, thinking of a normal version of the show and a slightly more spaced out version of the show. And we've made the decision, whatever happens, we'll go with the spaced out version, slightly more spaced out version, because now we've got one map we can look at rather than two. Sure. I think it's confusing me and confusing everybody else when we start talking about variants and all this sort of stuff.
I guess people will find that reassuring anyway, even if it's not required.
Yeah, I think we'll all feel a bit, won't we, that first time through when we go to shows and things, that there'll be a little bit of, strange isn't it, a year ago, was just after Aircon. And I'd been to Aircon, and it was a show, and we did it and everything. And there was lots of conversations, of course, at the time about what's it going to be like. And that was the last show. And of course, at that point, when we just used to being, and they were starting to do, so they were doing, I think they had hand sanitizers and cleaning hands and stuff like that. But it was only the beginnings of things. And in a year, we've got to the point now that you walk into a supermarket, you're a bit wary about if people are too close to you. Yeah. So I think I don't know how long it'll take us to get back to that being normal, again, that we're comfortable enough with crowds and everything.
It's funny for me personally, I don't think I'll have major issues. But what I will be aware of is that other people might. So if I'm happy walking around in a few thousand people at the expo, that doesn't mean that other people want to shake my hand now.
No, and I think there could be a lot of that, isn't there? That way people will be a bit reluctant to do certain things.
Which is a real shame, because that's one of the things that I love about the expo, and all events, but the expo in particular, because people come from all over the country and other countries, and you just see friends that you don't see otherwise. It's lovely to catch up, shake a hand, maybe play a game.
Absolutely, that's what we all miss, don't we? I mean, the online stuff, we've all been tried to do what we can do with these things, but it isn't clearly not the same as physically being in the same place and seeing people across there and waving and all this sort of stuff. We'll get there eventually. We'll get there. So.
All right, let's change tack a little bit. What's the first thing you're going to do once lockdown is lifted and all social distancing restrictions are gone?
Well, I haven't seen an awful lot of my sort of family, really, with the exception, obviously, the three of us here, my son and my wife and me here. Everybody else is in the closer family, rather in Crewe, or my daughter's up in Sheffield. And barring the one day of Christmas Day where we managed to, a very socially distanced sort of Christmas Day. A lot of planning went into involving a tent in the garden and all sorts of things, just to try and space things out and reduce the risk for my parents who came down for the day. Apart from that day, I don't think I've seen any of them since about September, October last year. So I think the being able to actually have everybody together in one place and being able to have meals, whether that be a pub or a restaurant or in someone's house, and just do the normal stuff that you tend to do a few weeks normally. I think that's the thing that we're missing the most. And then just being able to, the freedom of just being able to do the sorts of things that we, again, in a normal year, we would just take for granted, isn't it? Going to the cinema or the restaurants, a trip down to London or something for some reason. With the books that I write, I do a bit of historical research, and I always enjoy once or twice going down to London and staying for a day or two, going to the British Library, that kind of thing. And of course, none of that's been possible for so long. So I think that would be when it's possible, a nice trip somewhere would be very much on the cards.
You brought us very nicely onto. I was going to ask next. I know you're a big history buff, but how do you actually get into writing novels?
Well, this was something that I always used to enjoy. Tinkering a little bit at school and things, although I wasn't very good at sort of things like English literature. I used to hate it, but I think it was the subject I hated the most was English literature, to be honest, because it was just very badly taught. It was all about the third comma on the second line and all this sort of thing, and never enjoyed that as a subject at school. But I did enjoy sort of tinkering around with ideas for stories, and of course with the role-playing games, to some extent, you are creating a sort of a bit of a story when you're GM, and I tend to like to GM rather than play, to be honest, and creating the worlds and the environments and the characters and things that people interact with is very much part of the game in role-playing games. So there's always been a bit of that kind of going on. I think it was just when I was I've been working for quite a while in general practice, and early 30s, I think it was. I felt I could just do something a bit sort of to be doing at the moment, different from the day job. And obviously I was doing gaming and things, but that was a long time before we'd even considered doing expos and things like that. And then I just was reading the history of Anglo-Saxon times, and I came across a storyline that nobody had particularly done, as far as I could see. And in fact, it's a time period that not many people have written about. Nowadays, a lot of people have heard of the Bernard Cornwell series of Last Kingdom, which is a television series, of course. But the first of those hadn't come out at that point in time, so there was very little set in Anglo-Saxon period. And it's a period that fascinated me, because an awful lot of language and our laws and rules and the shape of the country and all sorts of things comes from that time period. So that's really where the inspiration to start writing came from, but as a bit of a hobby, for many years, really.
Fantastic. A man of many talents. Okay, well, by my reckoning, I can afford 5 questions in the quickfire round. So
okay.
This will be you just come up with the answer as quickly as you can.
Okay.
Okay, so first one. Beer or wine?
Beer.
That was a push.
Both. Beer to push. Yep.
Oh, board games or RPGs?
Board games. Yeah.
Game you wished you designed?
Oh, Agricola. So,
Oh yes, good answer. Fair enough.
Yeah.
France or Spain?
Spain.
Oh, I'm going to cheat here and just ask a little follow-up as to why Spain.
Because I've been to France an awful lot. I haven't been to Spain that often, and we've had various holidays that also always got cancelled for some reason. So I want to go to Spain, and there's lots of Spain I want to go and see, and I've not seen any of it. So
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I do need a follow-up to that one because I always find that answer interesting. Okay. Would you rather design a game that reaches #1 on Board Game Geek or write a Sunday Times bestseller?
I think the bestseller actually. I always wished I could, get the recognition for the books, as it were.
Yeah. Do you find that then? Do you feel you get more recognition for your games than your books?
Well, yeah. I mean, the games. I mean, the books I'm self-published. I sort of released the first books when Kindle came out on the UK, and they chug along nicely. Got a certain following of a few thousand people that sort of pick up each of the Anglo-Saxon series. But I'm not sort of I'm not Bernard Cornwell or J.K. Rowling or whoever. And I think the frustration with the books is that you get really good feedback and reviews and things, but yet you think. But it's really, to be honest, it's become that way with games nowadays. There's so many games that the market is just saturated, isn't it? And it's and you sort of think, look at me book, they're good, they're not bad. So yes, I would love that, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Oh well, you never know. All right, brilliant. I have one question left for you then, and this is a new one I was quite pleased with because you can do some work for me. Who do you think I should invite onto 20 Questions?
Right. I would invite in Andy Hopwood.
Yes, okay.
He's also really quite sort of clever ideas and things. I would think about Bez.
Yes, I had thought about Bez, to be fair.
Lots of ideas there as well. And who else? Somebody that's different in terms of not so much board games, but games related stuff would be someone like Phil Bodolsky from the All Rolled Up. They do the all rolled up sort of the game mat things and the game pack things that you can carry stuff in game bags. But they're doing this thing with. They've got this geek marketplace thing, which will allow indie publishers and things and so on to put their stuff on there as if it's a kind of virtual convention on an ongoing basis. So you have your own stand and things. I must post something. I've not posted for a week or two, but you post there. Stand 33, Medusa Games or whatever it is. Come and have a look at our game, this and so on. So they've got some nice ideas they're working on to try and help. I think during these difficult times, people get a little bit of exposure.
Brilliant. So, I wasn't aware of that, so I will look them up. That sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, brilliant, fantastic. Thank you very much for joining me, Richard. I really appreciate your time. Apologies to the viewers for any technical issues. Still learning how this works. Lots of fun resizing of windows going on, but hopefully it's been fun to listen to Richard. So thank you and take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
You've been watching Board Game Hub. Please remember to like and subscribe if you like the content. Until next time, farewell.